In this video we're going to use Hyperscript, HTMX and TailwindCSS, and we're going to build a user interface where we can click a button that loads up a form and we can then submit details about a book, and that will then be added to the database. When we hit the add book button, that gets added below. It gets added to the database in the back end with HTMX, and then Hyperscript will control whether the form itself is shown and whether the button is shown. And then when we fill the form out and then clear it with the cancel button, that will then dynamically remove that from the DOM, show the button again, and that's all using Hyperscript. Now in that case, Hyperscript is also used so that when we click the new button again, the input fields are cleared out and the user then is ready to enter new data. So all of those front end interactions, we're going to use Hyperscript to control those. And we're going to use HTMX to submit the form to the server and return the correct partial. And we're going to include custom HTMX events in this workflow. So let's get started and dive in. Now you can get some code on GitHub. There's a repository here with the starter code for this project. If you want to follow along with the video, you can start with this code. There's also a final branch that contains the final code at the end of the video. So let's dive in and we'll see how to build that UI now. So we have here a simple Django project. This is the base template, base.html, and this has 3 script tags that import Tailwind, Hyperscript and HTMX. We're going to need all 3 of these in this video. And we also have a body tag which attaches the CSRF token with the HX headers attribute. And this is necessary later on when we send a post request to add a new book to the database. Now our base template defines a content block, and we also have an index.html template. We're going to work in this file in this video and extend that content. Now what we need to do is we need to start by defining a Django model to store the book information in the database. So we're going to define that model class called book here, and we're going to give it 2 attributes. Firstly, we're going to have a char field for the book's name, and that will take a max length, let's say, of 100 characters. And secondly, we're going to define an author, and that is going to be a models.char field as well, with another max length, let's say, of 100. And we'll also define a _string method that will return the book's name. Now in a real system you might have the author split into a separate table, but we're going to keep things simple here and just make that a char field rather than a foreign key. But in a real database you probably want to store the authors in their own table and then join that up using a foreign key. So that's the model done. We're now going to run the make migrations command, and that's going to create that model migration file. And after we've done that, we can then run the migrate command, and that will actually change the database and create that database file for us. Now earlier on we saw that we were adding books with a form, so what we're going to do now is add a Django form in the forms.py file. Now at the top here we've imported forms from Django. We're also going to import that new model that we've created, and then we're going to create a model form. So let's call this class book form, and it's going to inherit from the forms.modelForm class. And within the model form, we define a meta class. This is an inner class, so a class within a class. And it has 2 fields that we're going to define. Firstly, we define the model for this model form, and that's going to be the book model we've just created. And secondly, we define what fields we want to show in the form for this model form. And the 2 fields are the name field and also the author field. So this is our model form, very simple, with the 2 fields on the model, and that's going to be shown on the front end, and we're going to use that. We're going to use it with Hyperscript and HTMX in a second. So now let's start building this UI. If we go to index.html, we've only got this message hello here. So let's run the Django development server and see how that looks like, and then we're going to build it out. So at the moment we've got this basic UI, it just says hello. Now we saw at the start of the video that we click a button that says new book, and that will load up the form that allows us to submit a new book to the back end. So we're going to start by building this button. Now we imported Tailwind at the start of this video, so what we're going to do here, I'm going to go to this site here, it's TailwindCSS.com, and we're going to grab this button here. We're just going to grab the classes that make up the styles for that button. So let's copy this button here, and we'll go back to our template, and we're going to paste that in here, and we're going to change the text within the button to say new book. And I also want to add a little bit of margin at the bottom of the button, and we're going to give it margin bottom 4, that's a class from Tailwind. And finally, let's surround that button with a div and give it some Tailwind classes. So this div is the container for all of the content. We're going to give it margin 12 so that it comes out a little bit from the side and the top of the page. And let's also give it a maximum width of the medium screen size. So if we save that and we can go back to the page, we'll reload that, and we now have this new book button. When we click this, we want to load up the form that allows us to submit a new book. So we need to render the form. So what I'm going to do now is go to the views.py file, and we want to add the form to our context here. So let's import that new form we created, the book form, and we'll add a key to the context with the name of form, and we'll instantiate that book form. So after doing that, the form is available in the context. We can go to our index.html file now, and below this button we can render the form as paragraph tags. And if we go back to the page and refresh, we now see the form. Now there's no styles attached to this at the moment, but the form is now there, it's available, and we can now style that as we need. Now what we're going to do is use django-widget-tweaks here to style these form fields in our UI. Now widget tweaks can be installed from pip. I'm going to link this page below the video, but you can copy this command here, pip install django-widget-tweaks, and you can then run that in your terminal, and that will install that into your environment. And once you've done that, you can add widget tweaks to your installed apps within the settings.py file. So let's go to settings.py, and at the bottom here, I'm going to add widget tweaks, and that will give us access to the template tag for rendering fields. So what we're now going to do is create a partial that contains our form. So this is going to be an HTML template. So let's create a partials directory, and we'll call this bookform.html. And this partial is going to contain the form that we use to submit a new book to the database. At the top, we're going to load the widget tweaks template tags. And what I'm going to do below that, I'm going to paste some HTML code here. And let's look at this code. We've got a div that surrounds everything. That's got an ID of add book form. And then we have a form element with some divs below that. Now each of these two divs is simply rendering out the form fields. For example, here is the name field from the book form. We use the widget tweaks render field template tag, and we pass the name of the field to that. And the benefit of using render field is that we can very easily in the template attach classes and any other attributes to our HTML form fields. And we're also rendering out the label for the form field and the errors for that field. And we do the same below for the author field. And at the bottom of the form, we have a div containing two buttons. Firstly, we've got a submit button that will submit the form. And secondly, we've got a cancel button here, which we're going to use to hide the form, and we're going to use Hyperscript to do that, and also to clear out these input fields when we click cancel. So that's our partial for the form. What we're now going to do is go to index.html, and we're going to clear this out, and we're going to use the include template tag here and actually include that partial. So it's going to be partials/bookform.html. And that will then inject that HTML into this template here. So let's run the Django development server, and we'll go back to the page and refresh. So we still have this form here, but it's not styled at all. We're now going to style it with TailwindCSS, and we need to style the two form fields and the two buttons. We're going to do this quickly, and we're going to grab some more styles from Tailwind's website here. Here we have a login form, and you can see it's got some styles here. And we're going to grab some of these classes. For example, here for the form tag, we're going to grab these classes, and we're going to copy that into the partial containing the form. We'll just paste that here. That gives the form element some styles, and that applies some styles to the form element as well as its children. The next thing we're going to do is add some classes to the label. So let's go back to this page. Now the labels here have these classes. Let's copy that here. So let's go back to the template, and we're going to add these to this label class here, and we can use the add label class from django-widget-tweaks, and that can attach these classes like so. And we do the exact same down below in the author label. Now you apply these filters to the field itself, so it's form.name, we get rid of the label here, and that should work fine. Let's go back to the page, and when we refresh, we now have some styles for the form and also the styles for these labels. What we're now going to do is add styles for the actual field itself, the input field. So let's go back to Tailwind, and here we have the input field, and we're going to copy this class here. Once that's been copied, we can go back to the template, and we can paste this in here. Now I'll link the Tailwind site that I'm using there in the description. Once you've added these classes to the form.name field that's used in the render field tag, you can do the same to the author field below. So let's just do that now. We'll paste that here, and that should add those to both the fields. And if we now refresh the page, we actually see the fields, and we have a border around those fields, and it's a little bit better in terms of the styles. So that's the fields. The final thing we need to do in terms of styling is add some styles to these buttons. So to do that, I'm going to just copy the styles from this button here for the new book. We'll copy those classes, and we're going to paste them into the book form's button fields. So these are now attached as classes to the two buttons. One thing we're going to change for the cancel button is instead of having that blue, we're going to change it to red, just to differentiate it from the other button. And we'll also give it some margin right so that the other button's not too close to it. So if we go back to the page now and refresh, we should now see these buttons have different colors and different styles. Now the final thing we're going to do before we start some Hyperscript is we're going to hide this form by default. Remember at the start of the video when we click the new book, we want to load up the form and display it on the page. So what we're going to do is we render the form as it is now, but we're going to give it a hidden class from Tailwind. So when the page first loads, this form is hidden. So let's go back to the template here. And to the div at the top of this partial, we're going to add the hidden class, and that will hide the form when it first loads. So let's refresh the page, and you can see we now don't see the form because that class sets the display to none. So let's now write some Hyperscript so that when we click this button, the hidden class is removed and the form is shown. So let's go to the template containing that button. It's the index template. And to this button, we're going to add the Hyperscript attribute. It's just an underscore. And we want to perform this action on the click event. So we say on click. Now what we want to do is remove that hidden class. So what we're going to say is remove the class of hidden. And Hyperscript has this remove keyword. And we want to remove that from a particular element. So we're going to say from, and then we're going to reference the ID of this surrounding div that contains the hidden class. So let's copy this ID, and then we can use that here with the hash symbol, and that will then remove that hidden class from the div on the click event. So let's save that and we'll go back to the page. Now what happens when we click this now is that we actually see the form, the hidden class is removed, and we then see the form. Now one other thing we want to do is hide this button so that when we click new book, the form comes up, but the button is then hidden. So we can also do that in the same statement here. So after we remove the hidden class from the form, we're then going to perform another action, and we're going to add the hidden class to me, and me references the element where this Hyperscript is defined. In other words, this button element. So to summarize, when we click the button, we remove the hidden class from the div with this ID, which will then show the form. And then we also add the hidden class to the button, and we reference the button with this me keyword. Let's go back to the page and we'll see if that works. When we hit new book, we then see the form and we can see that the button is now hidden. So that's working fine. What we're now going to do is handle submitting a new book to the database with this form, and we're going to use HTMX to do it. So let's go to the form element here in this book form partial. And to the form element, we're going to add some HTMX attributes. We're going to start with hxPost, and that determines where the post request is going to get sent. And we're going to reference a URL called index. This is a named URL that we already have in the urls.py file. And it's the one that links to this view that we're already using here, this functional view. So we're now going to modify that view to handle the post request in a second. Now HTMX will return a partial after this post request. So what I'm going to do now is set the hx target, and that's the target element in the DOM where the returned HTML will be swapped. And we're going to set this equal to the div with the ID of add book form, and that's just this div here. So when we submit the form, we want the returned content to replace everything in this div, and we want to also replace the div itself. So we're going to set an hx swap attribute of outer HTML. Now outer HTML just means that when we return HTML, it will take that HTML and it will look at the target and it will replace the target and all of its children with the returned content. So we'll see a demonstration of this in a second, but to summarize, we're sending a post request to a backend URL. After that processes and adds the book to the database, it will return new HTML, which will then swap into this target, and that will then replace everything within the div. Now the post request will be triggered when the form is submitted. We haven't specified hx trigger here because it's the default trigger for a form element. So when you add HTMX attributes to a form element, the default trigger is the submit trigger. So we don't need to specify that explicitly here. So with that, we can now modify our Django view, and we're going to allow that to process not only a get request but also the put request. So to start with, let's say if the request.method is equal to a post request, what we're then going to do is instantiate our form with the post data. So we're going to say form is equal to the book form, and we pass the post data to that book form. We can then check if the form is valid, and that is going to be by using the isValid method. And because it's a model form, if it's valid, we can call the save function, and that will then save the book to the database. And then if the form's valid and we've saved that item to the database, we can then return a partial that will be swapped into the DOM. So we're going to return, using the render function, the partials/bookform.html partial. And we'll attach a context here. So let's set up a context above, and again we're going to set the form key here, and we're going to set that equal to a new instance of the book form. Now in the event of an unsuccessful form submission, when the form is not valid, what we're going to do is set up a new context in that case, and we're going to set the form key equal to the instantiated form containing the errors. Remember, if it's not valid and we don't return this partial, we will have a form instance with some errors that we can then attach to the context. And then we can return the same statement here, the render method, and we're rendering that book form partial that contains the form with the form key in the context populated with the form and its errors and its data. So let's quickly summarize this post request. We instantiate the form with the post data and check whether the form is valid. If it's valid, we save the form, we create a new instance of the book form with no data, and then we return this partial here containing the form element, and then HTMX will take that partial, this one here, and it will re-render all of this content in this partial because it's the same one, and we've specified the target there as the wrapper for this entire partial. So it's going to replace all of that with a new form. Now in the case where the form submission is unsuccessful, we're going to keep the form with the post data around, and that contains errors which we're then going to return to this bookform.html. So in that case, what happens is the form here will be rendered with the errors. These errors fields will show up. Now we're going to see how this all works in just a second. But what I want to do now is add a bit of Hyperscript to the form element, this form element here. And what I'm going to do is when the form submission is finished, we want to then hide the form and then show the button again. So if we refresh this page, when we click the button, we show the form. But after we've added a new book here, after that request successfully completes, we want to then hide the form again and show the button. So we're going to write a little bit of Hyperscript on this form element. So again, we define the underscore attribute, and we're going to react to the HTMX after request event. And then what we can do is remove the hidden class, and we want to remove that from this button here that we're hiding after we click it. So we're going to give that an ID of add book button, and let's copy that into this Hyperscript here, and we'll say from the element with the ID of add book button. So let's save that and we can go back to the page. When we reload, we can click this button and fill it out with some data. When we add the book, we then see the form disappears and the button has the hidden element removed from it. Now the reason the form is disappearing is because when we return this partial, HTMX will swap that into the DOM, but this partial contains the hidden class from Tailwind, so when it's returned after the request, it will hide all of this content below. So every time the form is submitted, the returned HTML is hidden from the DOM, and then we can show the button again with this Hyperscript statement here. So that's all working fine, but we're going to demonstrate a problem with this approach now. What I'm going to do is go to the forms.py and we're going to add a validation function called cleanName here, and let me tab that across. And this is just a dummy validation function. If the name starts with the letter A, we're going to raise a form validation error and we're not going to allow that submission. Now the problem here arises because when we return this partial after processing, it contains this hidden class. Therefore, if the form has an error, in other words, if someone submits this form and the name begins with A, then the form will be rendered with the errors, but we won't actually see that form because it's got a class of hidden. So instead of that, we want to show the form populated with the data and the error field. Now let's see what happens if we don't do anything with that and just refresh the page. If we submit a user with the name beginning with A, when we add that book, it looks like nothing is wrong, but when we click new book again, we see that we still have that data and we have this error message below the field. So what we want to do is we only want to hide the form in the event of a successful request, but if the form contains the errors and it's populated with data, we want to show that form with the error message and then let users change the data. Now there's a very simple way we can do this for the hidden class. We can use a template if statement here and we can check if the form does not have errors. Now if the form doesn't have errors, that means it's been a successful request. So then we can add the hidden class and let the user submit the next book. So we only want to add the hidden class in the event that the form does not contain errors. If it contains errors, we don't want to add the hidden class, we want to instead show the form. So let's end the if statement and we can go back to the page now. If we refresh, add a new book, you can see that we don't hide the form this time because the form contains errors and therefore the hidden class is not added. So that's fixed that particular problem. If we go back to the page, you can see that we now show the button though. So when the form has errors, we show the form, we don't hide it, but the button reappears, and that's because of the Hyperscript we've added to the form element here. this line here will remove the hidden class from the button, and that will do that regardless of whether or not the form has errors. Now what we want to do is we only want to show the button when it's been a successful request, but if the form has errors we want to keep that button hidden and only show the form. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom HTMX event here called bookAdded, and we'll see what that means in a second, but I'm going to remove the HTMX after request event and we're going to replace that with a custom event called bookAdded. Now it turns out with HTMX you can return an HTTP header with a key of HX trigger, and you can set that equal to a custom event. So the HTMX response, when it's received, if it contains that header, it will then fire the new event, and then you can perform actions conditionally based on that new event. So in our case, we want to return a header with the HX trigger set to bookAdded, and then when HTMX receives the response after the form is submitted, it will then only remove this hidden class on that particular action. So what we're going to do is add that header, and we're going to do that in the view, and we want to add a bookAdded header only when there's been a valid submission of this form. So after the form has been saved, we want to set up this header. So what we're going to do here is I'm actually going to set a response variable here equal to the result of calling the render method with that partial, and then we can add HTTP headers with this dictionary syntax here, and it's going to be an HX trigger header, and we set that to the name of the custom event that we want to fire on the front end, and it's going to be the bookAdded event. So once we've added that header, we can simply return the response to the front end, and then when HTMX gets the response after a valid form submission, it's going to see the header with the event name of bookAdded, and it's then going to fire that event on the front end. And in this template, we're only going to remove the hidden class when that header is present. So let's go back to the page and we can test whether or not that works. When we hit new book and we try to add a book with the name beginning with A, we get the error message. The form is still showing, but we don't see the button because there is no custom event being fired, because that is only fired when the book is submitted successfully. So if we change the name to something beginning with any other letter, when we hit add book, we see that everything disappears and we get back the new book button. So that's all working fine. What I now want to do is wire up this cancel button and use Hyperscript with that. So when we click cancel, what I want to do is hide this form and show the button, but we also want to clear out any text that might be entered into these fields. When we hit cancel, we want to clear them out, and we can do all of this with Hyperscript. So let's go back to the template, and if we scroll down to this cancel button here, I'm going to add the Hyperscript attribute to that. So let's start simple here. When we click this button, we're going to add the hidden class to the form so that it's no longer shown. So we're going to reference this ID here, and this is the ID that wraps the form. So we're going to add the hidden class to that element, and we need to specify the to here. And we also want to remove the hidden class from the button that says new book. So after we've added that class, we can then remove the hidden class from that button. So let's go to index here and we'll reference this ID here, and we can paste that in here, and that will then remove that. So let's go to the template and we can test if this works so far. When we hit cancel, the form disappears and the button reappears. But what we also want to do is we want to clear this text out so that when we hit cancel and then we go to add a new book, it doesn't contain that previous text. So we can add another then to this Hyperscript statement, and I'm going to do this on a new line. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put an empty string, so we can use the put and then an empty string, and we're going to put that empty string into all input elements, and specifically we're going to put it into their value. So we use this very English-like style here. We're putting an empty string into all input elements on the page, but to make that work we need to put it into the value of that input element. So let's save this and we can go back to the page. If we refresh and we then try and cancel this, when we load up the form again, we see that the input elements no longer contain text. So that is working fine. So now that we've got our Hyperscript working, there's one final thing I'd like to do, and that's show the books that are being added below this form. So what we're going to do is go to the view here in the views.py file, and to the context on the get request, we're going to add a key with the name of books. And we're going to set that equal to book.objects.all, and that's all books in the database. And we also need to import the book model from the models.py module. Now to display these books, I'm going to create a new partial called booklist.html, and in here we're going to paste a UL tag with some list elements, and we're iterating over each book in the context and rendering out the book's name. So a very simple partial here. And if we go back to index.html, below this include statement here, we're going to include the book list partial as well. So let's see what that looks like. If we refresh the page, we have the 2 books in our database added below this form. So this is working when the page loads, but if we add a new book to the database, you can see that that doesn't appear immediately below, but if we refresh, we'll get that 3rd book. What we want to do is when we add a new book with the form, we want that to immediately display below the form. So what we're going to do now is go back to this book list partial that we've just created. We're going to add them to the UL tag here. So it's going to be hxget as a get request here. And we're going to get a named URL with the name of books here. And I'm going to create this URL in just a second. And we want this get request to fire when there is a trigger of that new custom event that we created. So the hx trigger is going to be the book added event. And to guarantee that that will work, we'll use this from body statement after the book added event. And again, we want to specify the hx swap as being outer HTML. So we're going to replace all of this content when we get a response. So to summarize this, when we add a new book, we have this book added event coming back to the front end. That's going to trigger a get request to this URL of books, which is going to return all of the books, including the new one. And that's going to be swapped into this element here and replace all of the content. So let's create this new URL with the name of books. In the urls.py file, we're going to paste that path in here. And we now need to create a view with the name of books. So just below this one here, we'll create a new function-based view called books. That's going to take the request as an argument. And we're going to set up a context here with a key of books, and it's going to return book.objects.all. So we're fetching all of the books from the database. And then we're going to return the render function, and we're going to render that new partial that we created. It's the book list.html, and we can attach the context to that. And what this means is that we are repopulating this key with books. So when HTMX returns this partial, it will contain the new book, and that can then be swapped in, and that new book is available in this for loop. Now this might not be the most efficient way of doing this because you're fetching every entity from the database, but we're going to keep things simple here. If you want to amend that, you can look at different ways to do that. But that should be all to make this work. So if we go back to the page now and refresh, we hit the new book button, we can then fill out this new book. And when we hit add book here, that will then appear below. So let's add a real book here. So let's add the book Brave New World here, and that's by Aldous Huxley. If we add that, we see that it appears at the bottom of this list. So that's now working, and the new book is being replaced dynamically. And the reason that this is working is because when we successfully submit a new book, this book added event is added as a header, and that then triggers on the front end. And then within the book list.html, we're listening for that event. And when it triggers, we send a request, a get request to the books endpoint, which then returns the list of books with this new book added. So that's all for this video. We've learned a bit about Hyperscript and HTMX and how they can work together along with custom events in order to create these interactive user interfaces. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're interested in more content along the lines of Hyperscript, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.